Okay, moving on now to Rudolf Steiner's commentary to the Gospel of Luke, which was given a year earlier in 1909, September 1909 in Basel, once again. And before we get to Steiner's first lecture, though, I want to give a general introduction to this Gospel. It's the third of the Synoptic Gospels, and it does appear to come after Matthew, since it seems to presuppose both Matthew and Mark, and then makes additions. We can see, for instance, that the writer now in the opening has two annunciations, not just the one where Matthew had the annunciation to Joseph. Now this time we get the annunciation to Mary, but even before that now the author of Luke, whoever he was, gives to John the Baptist an infancy narrative and an annunciation to his father, Zechariah, who is the husband of a new character, Elizabeth, whose name obviously means house of God. Beth is house, is always God. House of God. So we have Elizabeth and Zechariah, and they are from a priestly line. Zechariah is, I believe, a practicing priest, and his wife is barren, and then an angel appears to him and says, don't worry, Elizabeth will conceive, and she conceives John the Baptist. Who note, and this is absolutely crucial. So point number one is that we can see the narrative snowballing, which is further evidence that it comes after Matthew, because now not only is there an infancy narrative of Christ, whereas Mark had no infancy narrative, Matthew has an infancy narrative of Christ. Now we have an infancy narrative of Christ plus an infancy narrative of John the Baptist. So we can see the myth growing. These guys are adding to it. So that's point number one. Point number two is that the births are specifically 6 months apart, and we know Christ's birth was December 25th, although who knows, because that's the date for the birth of the sun god Mithras. That was most likely stolen from the Mithraic mysteries. The whole idea of Christianity is one-stop shopping. It's the Walmart of the spiritual world, to use a crude analogy. They want you to be able to get everything here so that you don't have to go to this or that different mystery cult, get initiated into the mysteries of Mithras. If you're a man, women can't do that, but they can go to the Eleusinian mysteries or the Dionysus cults, go get initiated into the Osiris mysteries. Christianity wants to take all that, and one of the reasons why it became so powerful was that it sucked in the motifs from all of those cults. It takes the epiphany of the grain in the Eleusinian mysteries, which is held up at the climax of those mysteries. That becomes the wafer, of course, and then the wine from Dionysus becomes the wine. So all these things are just drawn in slowly. They're just sucked right in to this huge spiritual system that wants to syncretistically pull them all together with this historical event. So 6 months apart now means that John the Baptist is born in June. And indeed, his feast day is right on the summer solstice. And the saying is, if he is to wax, I think, is this from the John Gospel? I think, if he is to wax, then I must wane. And of course, from the summer solstice, the days get shorter and shorter and shorter as John wanes for the God of the solstitial first half of the year, until with the birth of the sun and the birth of Christ as the sun God in December, then the waxing begins. The days begin to get longer and longer and longer. So they're plugged in. The author of this text specifically plugs them into the myth of the solstice twins, which is another very old myth motif, extremely old. That may go well back into the Neolithic, where at the site of, let's see, is it Çatalhöyük, and then it's a subsequent site. There's a subsequent site there that's escaping me, Nivali Chori, right, 8000 BC, where the central temple at Nivali Chori, you go inside of it. It's clearly affiliated to Göbekli Tepe, which is a relatively recent discovery that goes back to 10,000 BC and is the absolute oldest megalithic site in the world. It's astonishing in its sudden complexity. Here you have all these Paleolithic hunter bands, and the Paleolithic fallen into a dark age, basically, as the glaciers have melted, flooding this world. And then all of a sudden, bam, this astonishing, incredibly elaborate group effort to create these very large temple complexes with megaliths and lots of ferocious animals inscribed on them in really beautiful art. But here we have Navali Chori, which is a definite agricultural village, and the central temple is just a sort of square that you go into, and there are two pillars there. And these two pillars also do occur at Göbekli Tepe. There's just these mysterious two pillars, and they have arms on their sides with T-shaped capitals. Those are the Solstice Twins. I can put money on it that they are either the Solstice Twins or, as in the case of Kadis and Katapatis in the Mithraic Mysteries, the Equinoctial Twins. Either way, it depends on which tradition starts the year where. Does the year begin in the springtime? If so, you're going to have an emphasis on equinoctial twins. If the year begins with the summer solstice, or as our tradition with January, all depends. But these two, equinoctial twins or solstice twins, is very, very old. So that's point number one to notice about what Luke has done by adding this annunciation to Elizabeth's husband Zechariah. And making sure you know that John is born exactly 6 months earlier than Christ. There's a reason for that. So then, Luke then, as far as we know, was a physician from Antioch. So he comes from Syria, but this gospel was written in Greek in Achaia, which is in Greece. And so Luke became ethnically a Greek, we know that, and he was a friend of Paul's. But Paul had died in about 67 A.D., we saw that the Mark Gospel was most likely 64 or 65, with the deaths of both Peter and Paul in 67, and the Matthew Gospel probably around 70 or 71. This is more likely closer to 80. It seems larger. It seems to have a larger vista than the other two. So it is most likely written closer to 80. And then finally, the John Gospel, we know, was written around 90 AD, with John being the youngest of the apostles and having lived to be the oldest, apparently, and dies in 100 AD after writing the book of Revelation and the 3 John epistles. So that's really all we know about this guy Luke, that he was a Greek, and it's no surprise that we get an annunciation from a Greek to the woman, Mary, which is, of course, a transformation of Greek myths like Leda and the Swan, Zeus transforming himself into a bird. With the Annunciation myth, it's changed to a dove. The bird is the spiritual power that comes down to impregnate the virgin. So it's no surprise that Luke is a Greek. So that's basically the introduction and setup to this gospel. It's a little bit shorter than Matthew, although I do think it has a larger vista. What do we have here? 24 chapters, whereas Matthew has 28. So then moving into Rudolf Steiner's first lecture here, that is given a year earlier than his lecture commentary on Matthew. Steiner starts by saying, with regard, so far he's only given a lecture on the John Gospel, a lecture series on the John Gospel. And here he says, so the 3 synoptic Gospels are different from the John Gospel in the following way, and you have to take this into account. It isn't just a matter of the synoptic Gospels being more biographies of Christ, whereas the John Gospel is something different. It's more of the beginnings of a theology of Christ, and the events that it depicts are a little murkier, and the narrative is not quite as vivid and clear. Keep that in mind. There's a reason for that. The way that in the other three are very pictorial, very imaginative, very much have a narrative flow to them. But they're not quite as spiritually profound as the John Gospel. And he says, he rewinds and says, there are these 3 faculties, imaginative cognition, cognition by inspiration, and intuitive cognition. And so imaginative cognition is what happens when you are able to perceive into, you've shifted to a level of clairvoyance, a clear view of the images and pictures in the spiritual world. You could imagine, let's take a plant, let's say you put it in your hand, and if you abstracted all the colors from the plant in your imagination and you were able to see those colors before your mind's eye, they're not just nothing. Those colors signify spiritual beings in them that you might then be able to see with a certain amount of clairvoyance that always, for him, green always connotes something intellectual, something bright, clear, and intellectual. Whereas, let's say if you did the same thing with the color red and abstracted it and saw the spiritual beings in red, you would see that they were of a fiery temperament, a wrathful, fiery temperament, just as in Sankhya, as we saw in my lecture cycle regarding Matthew, or maybe it was Mark, actually. I'm losing track. That in Sankhya, you have those 3 gunas that characterize matter, prakriti, Sattva guna, which would correspond to the clarity of the green, and then Rajas guna, which is always red and corresponds to a fiery, wrathful temperament, and then Tamas guna, which has to do with a slothful, inertial temperament. So he says that would be imaginative cognition. You could see the spiritual beings. And this is also the difference between an individual who has risen to the level of clairvoyance and has freed themselves from the sense-perceptible world enough to rise to the level of clairvoyance. But this is not yet the level of an initiate, which has to do with the two higher levels. So let's say I saw a man on the street. So a man passes me by on the street. What I see of him is purely an outward visible manifestation. That would be analogous on the physical plane to imaginative perception, whereby if I can see the spirit beings, but now I can hear them talking to me, that's cognition now by inspiration, which is the difference between if I stop the man on the street and I find out his inner life by him communicating it to me through speech and telling me that he's overcome with depression or grief, or he's joyful and happy. Now, you can't find that out until he talks to you. Same thing with the spiritual world. You have to rise to cognition by inspiration to hear the inner word. This is hearing the word, hearing the voice of the muses. As the rishis were said to have heard the Veda. Shruti is what that means. They've heard the Vedas. And so that's cognition by inspiration, and that's moving up into the level of an initiate. Whereas the highest level would be intuitive cognition, or intuition as he calls it. And his use of the word intuition does not mean what Jung means by intuition, which is simply a sudden flash of insight that you get, that you know is true. You've perceived it, but not by reasoning it out step by step with Verstand or understanding. That's how Jung uses it. Steiner means the highest spiritual faculty. This is the faculty to not only to be able to see the spiritual world and the beings in there and hear them talking to you, but to actually identify with them, to experience what they experience. And this requires a great amount of love and compassion, so that the frequency that you're vibrating on would have to have been tuned very high to get to this level, to identify with them. This also enables you to read the Akashic record and to find out the past lives, your own past lives, the past lives of other individuals, which is a very complicated affair, as he gets to here in a moment. But those are the three faculties. And he says that the writer of the John Gospel, there's a reason why the pictorial aspects of it are quite a bit murky, because John does not emphasize imaginative cognition, but intuitive cognition. He's ascended to the highest level, and he also has inspiration. So he's operating at a different level than these other three, through intuitive cognition and also inspiration. Whereas the other three, and Luke especially, he says, is the most concrete of the three synoptic gospels in operating at the level of clairvoyant imaginations, pictures, stories, narratives, parables, but also inspiration, a bit of inspiration as well. So that's how he characterizes the differences between these gospels at this point. Whereas we saw in Matthew that in his commentary to Matthew that he had characterized the differences between the gospels from a different angle, saying that whereas Mark is concerned with a cosmic being, the descent of the sun aura uniting with the earth aura, and the operation of a sun god on the physical plane, Matthew is concerned with the physical and etheric bodies of Christ, whereas Luke, he says, is concerned with the astral and egoic, because it's concerned more with love and compassion, which comes out of the astral body. Desires and fears, most of the emotions come out of the astral body. Basically what science would then translate into, I suppose, the limbic brain, the mammalian brain, which is warm and emotional, something like that. But for Steiner, he would still say the physical organ's existence does not disprove the spiritual, because the spiritual makes the physical possible. And this is what materialists always miss. They point to the brain. Oh, you can remove chunks of the brain and it'll damage memory or damage this faculty or that faculty, whereas Karl Pribram proved conclusively that memory is actually holographic and it's stored in a diffuse wave pattern throughout the brain. And clearly, although Pribram was still a materialist, nonetheless, the physical organ does not argue for the non-existence of the spiritual. It's the other way around. The spiritual comes first and makes the physical organs possible. We wouldn't have a neocortex to think with if the spiritual beings that made it possible to incarnate within our bodies could not already think that way. You got to find the right components, like a radio transceiver. Find the right components to build the right receiver. Then you can pick up the signal. That's already there before you built that gadget. So this is what materialists get wrong over and over again. They're so fucking arrogant. I just get so sick of listening to them. So we have this difference, and then Steiner says, now, it is not the case that if you've risen to the level of an initiate and you can read the Akashic record and you want to find out the past lives of an individual, he says, let's take a John Smith, let's say, and you want to find out what his past lives are. It's not a simple matter because we have these four components, physical body, etheric body, astral body, and ego. And each one of these has separate incarnations or possibilities of incarnation. If you want to find out what a man's ancestors are for his physical body that has been passed along through the genes and sexual reproduction, then you do an ancestor search. You go into genealogy.com or whatever that takes the blood into account and genetics and who your parents were. But that's only on the outer physical plane. The world, as we perceive it through the five senses, is a visible outer shell. That's all we're seeing of an intensely deep spiritual world that is behind it and beyond it. And that's the rising to imaginative clairvoyance, is to be able to see that reality that exists behind the illusion of the physical world. So the Hindus had that much right in that respect, that the world is Maya. It is illusion. Doesn't mean it isn't real, as I think they take it too far, that it's all a dream. It's not a dream. That's not correct. A dream is a totally different thing than what we experience as incarnate beings in a physical body having experiences. Crucify a man to a cross and watch him die in agony, then tell me that's a dream. It is not. That man is dying in agony. But it's an outer shell that we're seeing here. We're not getting to the inward depths of things. So if you want to find out so a person can also have the reincarnation of someone else's etheric body, just as we saw before in Matthew that Christ has other etheric bodies, the Zarathustra body, for instance, and also the astral body. Moses, he says, inherits the etheric body of Zarathustra, which reincarnates in him at one point, whereas the Tot Hermes individuality that he thinks was historical, probably not, I doubt it, but inherited the astral body of Zarathustra. And so we have that. The astral bodies, you can inherit different astral bodies, you can inherit different etheric bodies, although those would be relatively exceptional cases because most people's etheric and astral bodies aren't that developed. They're not to the level of a Moses or a Zarathustra, where then the principle of spiritual economy kicks in to preserve those so that they can be copied, so that they can be inherited by other individuals because they've risen to a level of perfection. The average herd animal on the street, the Joe Schmo, the Joe Six-Pack, his astral body and his etheric body on the other side, those are going to disintegrate. They're disposable. Nobody wants them, believe me. So then the ego too. So the ego is really the prime unit that reincarnates. It's the monad that carries the personality along with it. Contrast this with India, where the reincarnating monad, whether it's the Purusha or the Jiva, does not carry the personality along with it. It's a totally impersonal, homogeneous unit. That's wrong. As I found in my researches communicating with the dead, they do remember their personalities, and they say that their personalities are generally the same from incarnation to incarnation, whether they incarnate as a man or a woman, as a doctor or a lawyer or a poor man or a poet. They still have personality traits that are a running thread through those incarnations. That's an absolute fact. So I think Steiner has this right here, that the ego does reincarnate from lifetime to lifetime. And it's a different thing if you want to find out what a man's past lives were. In most cases, it'll just be the ego that we're talking about, because very few people have inherited etheric and astral bodies from other exceptional individuals because they would make that individual exceptional. Interview a Sri Aurobindo, and chances are he's got someone else's etheric body in there or someone else's astral body. So this is a very complex matter doing spiritual research on the past lives of individuals. But this is what Steiner is doing by going through all four Gospels, because they each look at Christ from a different angle. They look at his subtle bodies from a different angle, because this is a very complex individuality. Steiner tries to, though, resolve the differences between, as we've seen, Luke, who describes what he calls the Nathan child, the child who is descended from Solomon's son Nathan, whereas Matthew describes the Solomon child, or David's son Nathan, and then David's other son Solomon, then the Jesus of Nazareth in Matthew is the Solomon Jesus. So he thinks these are two different children, and that one dies at 12, and the ego of Zarathustra then passes over into this other child and is there until he's 30, where it's displaced by the Christ ego, that he willingly offers his physical body to the Christ ego. I don't know. I don't know. I doubt it. Let's just say I doubt it. Steiner's got lots of things in his stuff that I think are true, but they're bound up with myths. And so it's very difficult to disentangle the myths that he's making up in a naive, mythopoeic way with the truth that making the myth makes possible. That's the tricky thing about myth, is that you can't just say because there was never any Atlantis, that the Atlantis myth that he makes use of doesn't make other things possible that actually are true, that we have gradually lost our spiritual abilities over time, that the human psyche has gradually become more and more conceptual, more and more concrete. If you go from the Paleolithic to the Greeks, that's exactly what's happened. There's no question about that. In the myth of Atlantis, where everybody had full clairvoyant capacities, just makes that truth, that perception possible. So the myth of the two Jesus boys, it's a myth, I'm sure of it, but it makes other things possible. So he tries to reconcile the differences between the two narratives in a bit of a way it's a bit too literal for my taste. And I find it interesting that Steiner never talks about any of the Gnostic Gospels. For one thing, his myth is a Gnostic myth. Yahweh is a totally separate being from Christ. They're not consubstantial. Yahweh is a moon god and withdrew when the moon withdrew from the earth, and he's operating in the moon, whereas Christ has come from the sun, and when the sun and the earth separated, he went with the sun. So these are two different beings. It's just like the Gnostics saying that Yahweh is the one of the archons, Yaldabaoth, who has created this prison of the planetary spheres that capture the soul and imprison it and torment it on the physical plane. But beyond him is the Christ being, the other God, the God beyond God, who has brought Yahweh into being. Yahweh is a lower deity in the Gnostic tradition, and that's clearly the ontological status that he has in Steiner's Gnostic myth. But there's an infancy narrative I was reading the other day. The dates from the time, it's supposed to have been written by Thomas, about the time of the Thomas Gospel. But the Gospel according to Thomas is the oldest of the Gnostic texts. It actually dates from about the same time as Luke here, about 80 AD. It's only a sayings gospel, not a narrative. But it is the first official Gnostic gospel, and it's even earlier than the John Gospel. But the narrative, there's a Gospel of Mary, most likely Mary Magdalene, and it was supposed to have been written by Thomas around the 2nd century AD, probably the latter half, between 150 and 200 in there somewhere, and the infancy narrative of Christ, of Jesus. And in that infancy narrative, as I was reading it just out of curiosity, I read through it. It's not particularly skillfully written. This guy's not a storyteller. All it does is have Christ performing one miracle after the next, and it's just tedious repetition. Yeah, we already saw that miracle. He already healed the leprous girl. He's just an infant during this whole time, 3 to 7 years old, right in there. Although the second one, there are two of these, and the second one it's somebody else who has written the same narrative, but is a better storyteller and picks out more salient points, but it's only fragmentary. And this guy focuses on Christ as a mean kid who's using his powers to kill other kids who have wronged him. One kid is running and slams into him. Every kid's had that experience. You get the wind knocked out of you, you fall to the ground, you're like, God damn it, you motherfucker. And then Jesus says that, probably the equivalent, whatever, in Aramaic, and the kid dies. He teaches the alphabet to a teacher in the other gospel, to a teacher, and he gets pissed off at the teacher. He puts a curse on him, and the guy dies. I think that's interesting, that there's, as a young man, that there's a shadow side to Jesus that is never mentioned. It's totally heretical to mention anything like that. Anything particularly human, anything to do with sex, anything to do with the lower emotions like revenge, are carefully edited out. So that we don't really have, whoever Jesus was, trust me, he was a guy just like everyone else. In that respect, he was human too, because that's the physical body. Those are energies that are in the physical body. You don't get to escape them. Everyone has to experience them, but you can transcend them. And I think that the Jesus of Nazareth did, over time, learn how to get control over his astral body and transcend it and vibrate at a higher frequency to teach everyone about love. Love thy neighbor. If your enemy slaps you, offer the other cheek. And the other thing about the infancy gospel that I just want to mention before concluding here is that author notes the differences between the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke. In Matthew, we have the Exodus into Egypt. Luke never mentions that. In Matthew, we have the Magi, 3 Magi, who are Zoroastrian, coming to find him, the Christ child. We don't have that in Luke. We simply have the presentation to a flock of shepherds. It doesn't even say how many there are, who just happen to be in the neighborhood, and they go into the cave and check it out. So he tries, whoever this author was, to combine both of those into a single narrative. So he traces the exile into Egypt and all these miracles that the baby Jesus sort of inadvertently performed in Egypt. And then he comes back and he has both the shepherds coming in to check out the birth inside of a cave, in this case, and the Magi then coming in, and it specifically says they lit a fire and worshipped it, which means that it was very clearly understood that these were Zoroastrians. Those are the fire worshippers. Even in Melville's novel Moby Dick, and I noticed this, by the way, this is left out of every single film adaptation of Moby Dick that I've ever seen. All of them are bad. I've seen them all. And one of the big mistakes they make is just simply trying to tell an adventure story like Jaws. Jaws is basically Moby Dick stripped of its philosophical digressions and popularized, and it works beautifully. Moby Dick does not work because Moby Dick is a philosophical novel and mythological. And this is the detail that is always left out, that below on the Pequod, on that ship below decks, there has stowed away a crew of Zoroastrians, fire worshippers, who are expert whale hunters as well. And at a certain point of the narrative, I think it's about a third of the way into the book, they come up from the hold and they scare the shit out of everyone. These creepy guys, where did these guys come from? So Melville is very specific that they are Zoroastrian fire worshippers that have stowed away on board this ship. Every single film adaptation I've ever seen leaves that out. You can't do that and still have Moby Dick. If you take those kinds of details out, you don't have Moby Dick. It doesn't work that way. So there's a lot of simple-mindedness in seeing just a whale adventure. Let's go kill the whale. That's just the outer physical. Once again, materialists who get stuck with the outer physical and they don't understand the anagogical readings, the symbolic readings, the mythological readings, the spiritual readings. And so we'll leave it there then. The infancy narrative that I'm talking about does not really work. It's badly written and it's tedious and monotonous, but it shows that there was an awareness that the two infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke did not jibe. And so this guy tried to reconcile them by creating one single narrative out of them, whereas Steiner accepts the literal fact that they're totally different because there must be two totally different Jesus boys, which I think is an unnecessary way to resolve this, but it's his myth, and it's interesting, it fits beautifully, and he manages to make it work as a myth. For the introduction to the Gospel of Luke.